Good morning, Joan, and so wonderful you can join us also, Andrea. Good evening.
Good evening.
Hi there. Nice to be with you.
Welcome to you both. I just wanted to raise initially this Inside the White Cube exhibition, which we held at Bermondsey in 2012. We installed 9 of the now iconic 16mm films and videos from the late 60s, performed by Nauman in his San Francisco and Long Island studios. At the entrance of the show, you'll see wall and floor positions on a monitor. And then we screen the film walking in an exaggerated manner around the perimeter of a square. Both were sort of included in the Tate installation, Andrea. And here we are at the entrance of the Tate exhibition with the legendary The True Artist Helps the World by Revealing Mystic Truths. I really just wanted as a starting point to hark back to those studio days and really how informative they were in terms of Bruce's practice there on in. I just wondered if I could leave that with you and leave you to it.
Thank you, Irene. Joan, perhaps I start from the entrance of the Tate show. I will say there are many entrances. This is one possible entrance. Actually, if you enter the Tate Modern now, if you could access it, enter the Tate Modern now, you will have a glimpse of sound and encountering raw material as a sort of chant, as a sort of choir that you will be then discovering when leaving the exhibition and leaving the galleries. So this is more a sort of manifesto, it's sort of a sort of iconic gesture that we made. On the one hand, referring another exhibition where his iconic work was exposed, but mostly somehow suggesting the movement that the exhibition, the Bruce Nauman survey show we presented at Tate Modern has, which to some extent is about moving the body as a viewer within a space and not only facing works, like being choreographed by Bruce Nauman and not only himself choreographing himself was a sort of suggestion we wanted to share by installing the True Artist as a frontal work. It's a very early work that was made in 1967 and depicts a spiral and does refer to a beer neon sign. What we can say and what we should also say, and what is very important, is this is the first work that presents a text, a neon, the first neon that presents a text in Bruce's career. So I would say that's the main reason why, as an icon, we wanted to keep the True Artist at the entrance of the show, one of the many entrances of the show. When one reads, she has to do a sort of mental movement if you want to read the whole sentence. So this mental movement is a movement that will follow you throughout the show.
To put it in context, when Nauman first made it, as Andrea said, it was inspired by an actual beer neon sign in the window of the studio. And from very early on, it was meant to be seen from inside and outside, so that you could read it in reverse and also right reading. I recently asked Bruce Nauman about the words, "The true artist helps the world by revealing mystic truths." Did he himself know any such artists? And his answer was, well, first he laughed. Then he said, not right offhand. I was talking with Bob Irwin one time, and he said someone had asked if he had any mentors. And he said, maybe 10 or 12. Some are still alive and some are not. Some made work I didn't like and some not. People kept working. That's what helped him. I think about that. People I know who just keep working. It's important to know those people are out there.
Wonderful. Maybe we should move on and see other works. This is a room I'm familiar with. This is a room that somehow presents what we call the brain of the show, the many possibilities media and the many direction that Bruce took from the very beginning of his practice. And one can see film projected on a wall, monitoring monitors, sculpture, fiberglass, steel on the floor, couple of videos that were introduced by Irene. Every work, every video and film work in this room has a very specific relation to sound, has a very unique way of dealing with either the sound of a body, of himself, like bumping into a corner, or the sound of the feet stamping on the floor, or the sound of the environment within his studio. And this presence, this very discrete presence, is a presence that we really wanted to highlight as a major feature, as a major thread in Bruce Nauman work. And another work I want to perhaps suggest to somehow pay attention to, although it's invisible or not really visible, is that steel plate on the floor, first poem piece. If you could read, you would read, "You may not want to be here." In this very specific way to address the viewer. It's something I'm sure John will come back to, but is a crucial preoccupation for Bruce when dealing with what does it mean when the language becomes something that is in between an instruction, a suggestion, a poem, a philosophical reference, but also a specific way to address a frontality. The artist may not be there, but he talks to you in your eyes, in your mind somehow.
Also in the room are works of his in many very different media. The plank leaning on the wall is made of fiberglass, a cast of the space beneath his chair, where he typically will show something not normally seen, but make it visible. And the two pieces, one on the wall and two on the stands on the right, are casts of Bruce himself. One he's seen from the back with his hands bound, and the other are pairs of his own hands. The pairs of hands are cast in bronze.
One of the major preoccupations that the show highlights is something John has been very interested throughout the years when writing and when talking to Bruce, the representation of the body in its entirety, or fragments of the body, be hands, or be a head, or be the top side of the body. That's quite important, I guess. It's also very interesting to try to share with the viewer all these aspects. It could be a mouth, like the mouth being manipulated, one eye, and so on. And this is maybe one of the most well-known early videos. What should be say? What can be added in Work with Contrapost is, as all early videos that are normally shown on, or that must be shown on monitor, they will last 60 minutes, and they feature the artist himself performing an action. And this action, of course, normally has to do with being out of balance, forcing his own body, and forcing his own body, not only performing or dealing with the idea of the sculptural classic posture, which is the contrapposto within a corridor, which is another very important element in Bruce Nauman early work, but also through a given time, which is the time of a video cassette of the era, and corresponds to 60 minutes. So it's an endurance. I'm sure, John, you have something important to say about this work.
I do have a few things that interest me about the work. Here, he's using the corridor as a prop, as a stage set, filming himself walking within it. He next comes back to the idea of the corridor as he does often, return to many of the same ideas. He exhibits it as a sculpture, and many years later, he returns to the idea of this performance, and he walks with contrapposto again, without a cardor, in his studio in many, many variations. It's called the Contrapposto Studies.
What I can say about this work is that was titled is Going Around the Corner piece. It was made in 1970. And it as you can see, it's or as you can guess, it displayed in the show at the Tate Modern. Is that two major features are at stake. One is a wall, it's a prop, and the other two monitors. But what you can also see hanging on a corner of the wall is a camera. And as soon as you see a camera, you imagine there is a logic has to do with being taped, possibly or potentially live. The reason why we wanted to present this work was exactly the reason why I somehow try to describe the spiral as a movement that goes from the mind to the body of a viewer, but also this being an important work when the artist stops choreographing himself or begins to give up to choreograph himself only, and also brings the viewer within a situation of becoming the work or being touched by the work or acting with the work. The logic of this work that you can't see if you don't perform it is that you will work towards the monitor you see on your left side, and you will see the shadow of yourself leaving as soon as you turn, leaving the monitor. So you have the impression of being videotaped. And as soon as you turn the wall, you see the same image in the monitor that you're facing. You somehow keep following yourself and being surprised by not seeing yourself. And you see up the back of yourself going around this wall. So it's a sort of paradoxical situation, a sort of form of torture, a very subtle and soft form of torture, which of course was enabled by what Naumann was working back in the days with fellow artists, which is the idea of how revolutionary was medium as a video that could like display time in real time back then in the late 60s. As you see, I could speak for hours, but I leave it to the master, John, who's been writing about this also far more than me.
What's interesting about this piece is part of Naumann's progression of an idea. If the first videos were in his studio and he was using himself as material, because he said anything an artist does in the studio is art, and he had very little money at the time for material, so he used himself. With this type of work, he's allowing others in as the subject and as the animator, and changes it from sort of a still camera focused on one person running the length of the videotape, whether it's 60 minutes or the length of a reel of film in the early ones, 10 minutes. This is ongoing, active, and invites the audience in.
Yes, completely. And this I will leave to John. We are now outside the studio, and that's an important step also.
Yeah. Naumann moved from California to New Mexico in '79. In addition to his work in the studio, he trains horses, raises cattle, and needs to do ranch tours to keep it all going. This is an unusual video for Naumann. He rarely has worked outside for the motion picture work. He did some very, very early on in the 60s with fellow artists. And he shows himself riding. He's doing a maneuver called the rollback, which is used to shepherd cattle. He did two versions of this. Initially, it was done for a dance performance, for the stage set of a dance performance. And the images were shown on two very big screens at the back of the stage. And then he created this installation. I'm going to point your direction to the chair right in front of those two monitors. Imagine the slide of Naumann in his studio. You'll see a similar configuration of the chair, which he would sit in watching his videos. That point of view is recreated here. The chair actually is one that came from his studio and exists with the piece. The other unusual thing about this video is the color. Again, taking footage that was shot, he manipulated in editing the color. He flipped it upside down alternately among all of these videos. So taking in both at the same time would have been, one, his perception of watching his own videos in his studio, and actually thinking about himself. One can see himself outside as well with his other domain of work. So this is the earliest work in the White Cube show. And again, this is another of the rare videos that show him outside. And what he's doing is setting the corner post so that he can build a fence. And the red machinery at the right is an auger, which is used to drill down and make the hole to set it firmly in place in the ground. Now, the video opens with the work. Naumann, using two parts within one title, is very typical of him. One part usually describes, and the second part is not a secondary thought, even though it's in parentheses, but amplifies the first. And that's true of his film, Setting a Good Corner, paren, allegory and metaphor.
And this is the reason, if I can add, for having displayed Setting a Good Corner, allegory and metaphor outside the Tate exhibition. So when leaving the last room, the visitor will encounter a monitor and this work. And this work somehow completing the circle between the true artist reveals, helps the work by revealing mystic truth and Setting a Good Corner, allegory and metaphor. And what is an allegory and what is a metaphor? Is it setting the good corner? Does the work refers to something else? Is this gesture a metaphor for something else? We kept it open, completely open to the reading of the viewer, but somehow we also wanted to suggest, as Joan, you were stressing, being outside, like being in the open landscape. And if you want the idea of like verticality and horizontality, I mean, the artist is actually inserting a beam into the soil and generating a corner. And this is, we kept it also as a sort of sculptural movement and a specific idea about what does it mean to set something vertical within a landscape.
This video also, like many of Naumann's videos, has ambient sound. So you hear the dogs howling. It's done during the course of the day, and within the video, there are walk-ons by Susan Rothenberg, the painter Susan Rothenberg, who's married to Naumann. Their dogs come in, you hear all kinds of sounds. And this is true also, for example, for the earlier Green Horses video that was shot by the Vasulkas, Woody and Steiner, and you hear them chatting in the background. And it will be true in other videos that are included in this show.
The chair and the cat. Yeah, I think John, this is could be also an important, let's say, mirror to what you were saying on the chair, the monitor, and also the fact that this is a component of a different work we can speak about later, and there are two elements we should highlight. Different work is mapping the studio, but the element that we can begin to raise now here is something that was for John a crucial preoccupation, particularly in the essay that you wrote for the Tate catalog, which is how Bruce has been revisiting himself and his work throughout time, and how he's been also keen on let's somehow like seeing the same work from different perspective and transforming it and taking something out from something that was already there. And that to that extent, Raw Material is a perfect title for a sort of survey, but is also a very good metaphor, a very good allegory to speak about how everything is raw material, and regardless if it's a night shot of a cat working throughout the studio, or the studio itself in this very condition. This work is displayed also in the White Cube show in Hong Kong. John, have you seen this work in person?
A long time ago, yeah. No.
Yeah.
What's interesting is, again, the studio goes back to his early films and videos where he performed a task or an action in the studio, and the studio was the backdrop, the setting, but it was critical that it was there. Over the years, he's brought forward the idea of using the studio itself as material. So in this sequence of works, the mapping the studios, there were 4 unique works. He shot them all with a infrared video camera, or a video camera with infrared capability. And the raw material out of this camera has already a greenish, grayish palette. The very first version was titled Mapping the Studio, parentheses, Fat Chance, John Cage. And that developed the title from a request to participate in a show at Anthony Dauphé's gallery in London that was showing some of John Cage's scores, and was also supposed to include contributions by contemporary artists responding to Cage. And Bruce sent to Anthony Dauphe a fax that said, Fat Chance, John Cage. Anthony Dauphe thought it was a rejection, and Bruce thought it was the work.
Thank you for this beautiful anecdote. We are both now seeing the display at the Tate Modern and how the work was displayed at the Tate Modern. This particular version is co-owned by the Centre Pompidou and the Kunstmuseum Basel, and has the characteristic of highlighting one of the points we wanted to highlight in the show, which is the importance for Bruce of color, and very specific color, red, blue, green, and yellow in particular, and how important color is in his work. And throughout the journey, throughout the show, one will encounter the same color or other colors, and we try to display them as if we were thinking of composing a song, a strange song. What I also wanted to highlight now is the presence of sound and silence. As Joan was describing in the case of setting a good corner, what one can hear throughout the 5 and 45 minutes hours of the work of the installation is the sound of dog barking, coyotes howling, of the cat passing through the studio. And that's also one of the reasons why this work is at the beginning of the show at the Tate. On the one hand, one enters directly in Bruce's studio. The size of the room must be more or less the size of the studio. On the other one, one is confronted to this constant feeling of rotating, because as the title says, the images flip-flop, and the color changes. So somehow, if you want to follow an ideal action, you have to turn on yourself. And clearly what you also see, if you spend a little bit time into the show, are details that then will be appearing throughout further works. For instance, in a corner, as we saw in a previous image, you will encounter, your gaze will see 2 heads. And these 2 heads are quite important because will appear already appeared in previous works by Bruce. So a apparently simple night mapping of the studio is a sort of kaleidoscopic journey within so many preoccupations, and yet a completely new work when it appeared in 2001.
So it's a portrait of what went on in the studio at night that he shot with a fixed camera for many, many, many nights. His intention was that it be a kind of stage set for whatever would appear whenever. It was inspired, in fact, by the house and the studio being overrun by mice that summer. And he decided, again, he didn't have an idea, use what's available. And he was hoping to see when the mice, the moths, and his cat would turn up, which they did. But there are also long durations within the footage where absolutely nothing happens. You don't see a cat, you don't see a mouse, you don't see a moth. Of the 4 unique variations he made, one of them selects only the footage, the raw material, where an action happens. And that's reflected in the subtitle. It's just, he just moves from one idea to the next because, well, how do you use this raw material? How do you edit it? How do you curate it? How do you present it? You know, then there's the version with flip-flopping and color variations. He keeps recombining the ways he can alter his view of the work and our perception of it. Then he makes a separate work, which is the slide that we saw. And for that one, he chooses only sections where the cat appears or doesn't. Many sequences in this particular video have, you know, startling sights of the cat where the eyes glow bright white, of course, because of the camera and the lighting. But you see this cat inside the studio, outside the studio, behind the screen door to the studio, when you only see the pinpoints of light of the eyes behind the screen. What distinguishes this one from the others is how he manipulated the sound and why that is in the title. He altered and exaggerated the raw material of the sounds, the coyote, the wind, the rain, that you hear in the others, but he extended it, manipulated it. I mean, it's the focus of his idea, even though The visual is the cat. So it's quite an elaboration of how he uses sound and also changes that from the raw material.
The cat comes back.
Right. The cat may introduce is Mr. Rogers. Name turns up in the title. The video at right is the first of a new series of video works he did. And Naumann shot this with an iPhone resting against his chest on the table of his studio manager, Juliet Myers. So his hands are free. And what he does is he attempts with the two pencils in his hands, which you don't see off screen here, to pick up a little pencil, also two ends sharpened, which is on the table surface. During one of his attempts, Mr. Rogers walked across and he really liked that impromptu move, his performance, and kept it. And then he continued to work on the idea, working with his technical advisor, Bruce Hamilton, redid the performance of the pencils, the pencil holding, but eliminating the actual studio detail background and showing it on a blank white field. This diptych is shown at very large size. And when it was shown in Paris at the Fondation Cartier, it was shown on a billboard size LED display. And you could see the piece from outside the glass wall Cartier building from the street side, as well as within its ground floor gallery. So out of this, it seems, the configuration of the three pencils, Naumann saw another idea, and it's a little bit complicated to explain, but it reminded him of an idea he had explored in architectural installations earlier in the 70s. And it's the parallax effect. So it needs a little explanation of what the parallax effect is. It's an illusion that one creates for oneself when you see two objects shown close together. So Andre, I'm going to ask you to join me in doing this. Okay? I'm going to demonstrate it. You put your hands together, your fists, and you position your thumbs between a half inch and inch, close. And you look between and beyond the space of your thumbs. What started to appear for me, you see something floating between them, a phantom image that is floating out there. So, Andrea, did you see yours?
Yes.
All right. So, going to the next videos, Bruce wanted to actually show this effect, but how can you show something that doesn't exist? So he went back to the pencil holding. The image on the right is recreating the idea of the floating bit of pencil between the pencils. But of course, we had to create this image because only a person themselves doing the action will see it. So Naumann and Hamilton created one video with the fake float. And then they took a second video with Naumann standing in front of it and positioning his elements, moving it up and down to look like they created the float. And the ambient sound in this is Bruce speaking with Bruce Hamilton and exchanging thoughts. And at one point, as he's moving his hands up and down to frame the invented image, you hear, okay, is the camera ready? I'll have to pay attention. I'm not sure I'm quoting it exactly, but that's the point. Of course, Naumann is famous for a number of works that require you to pay attention, whether he's used the words pay attention please or the more vehement Pay Attention Motherfuckers for a work that's just called Pay Attention. Of course, he's altered the force of this command by printing it in reverse.
Well, this also circles back so beautifully to what you were explaining, Joan, when you told us how the true artist helps the world by revealing mystic truths was displayed. Like, you could see it from the outside and from the inside. So you could see it from the other side. And actually, in front of Pay Attention, we have now the lithograph. We have now the same impression of being exactly mirrored in the back of the work. A little but quite important detail.
Yeah, and when Naumann represented the U.S. in the Venice Biennale, he actually installed the true artist in a window that was opened up for the occasion, so you could see the piece from within the entry area, and circling the building, you could see it from the other side.
Combinations of 5. Thumb, first finger, second finger, third finger, fourth finger.
So typically, if he did it once, he would do it many times. And so he did it first, with his thumbs. And then he did it with his, what he calls first finger, but I would call an index finger.
Yes.
Then he did it with multiple fingers, digits. And you always see his shadow of his hands as he's demonstrating this. One critic described the floating element as sausage-like. So the variations, he would start with his thumb. Another variation, he starts with his fourth finger. One thing that fascinates me about this is Naumann studied fine art when he was an undergraduate. He also studied mathematics. He also worked in music. And there's a concept that's always fascinated him in mathematics called topology. And the reference is, how do you use a material that can be bent or reshaped to a different shape, but never lose the integrity of the original material? In other words, it's never cut, it's never ripped, but the actual whole of the material remains the same spatially, even if the configuration has changed. It would be like, another example is if you had a loop to play cat's cradle, and you never changed the form of that loop, but you could manipulate it to get many different structures out of the same exact material.
Where do we head to now in our journey? I'm wondering.
This monumental two-part video is taking its subject from a piece of music and exercises for children.
Yeah, again, the hands, it is like all the combination of the thumb and finger. We discussed briefly about the approach to parts of the body, to the possibility of playing with a simple basic material with very different combination. This, of course, as you can see, is a video installation. What changes is the backdrop, like black or white. There is something clearly monumental, light, frontal, yet light in the sense that in the end it's hands performing gestures and codes, and somehow also revealing the possibility of language not necessarily only being associated to text and to letters, but also to the way we can communicate among human beings throughout hands, and not only. These are clearly hands. It's a series that Bruce Naumann worked on in 1995, 1996. They're actually white bronze, like installed on, as you can see, on a painted white pedestal, and it's different configurations that require the visitor, the viewer, once again, to move around, to rotate around a very simple vertical sculpture, to see, to get all the different combination, all the different potential perspective, all the details, but also requires the viewer also to guess what this gesture is about, what the reason is for the artist having frozen that specific gesture. And the answer can be any kind of answer, from like the communication codes in the street culture to the communication codes towards who is hearing impaired or deaf, to the simplicity of the form of our hands as a potential representation of forces. Right? And this tension in various forms, subtly or explicitly, is always present in Bruce Nauman work beyond media. This is a work that with Nick Serota and Katie Vaughan, we were very keen on from the very beginning, considering the exit from the exhibition, the point you will leave from. It has quite unexpected layers and quite unexpected characteristic. On the one hand, clearly you see elements you're familiar with. On the other, you are suspended, as all figures are, into a black background. So everything is suspended. You leave the show and you go through this work in a state of suspension somehow. Everything is slowed down. There's a really beautiful soundtrack, so to say, that alternates noise to a more ambient sound, and the ambient sound comes from the magician manipulating a balloon and transforming it into an animal, into sort of dog, or from the sound of the slapstick sound of one of the actors that are framed falling. The work has very much to do also with magic and with tricks, and with the idea of a fascination that Bruce Nauman had for magic tricks that perhaps has to do with his grandfather, but for sure has to do with the idea of balance. And this was one of the major preoccupations we wanted to share with our audiences. What is balance, and what does it mean to be well balanced and be in the space, within a space? This is a sort of dialectic that goes through the entire work of Bruce Nauman. Him like getting off balance when working with contrapposto in a structural prop, or getting off balance when working around a square, and somehow putting also the viewer into a situation of potentially getting out of balance, or not knowing what is the good position to get the entirety of the work, as well as a layer of slapstick of how simple it is to fail, and how it is possible to fail, and how one doesn't need to be afraid of failing.
What's very interesting for me about the card trick one is that Bruce said his intention wasn't to show the trick, because he abides by the magician's code. But what it was really about was how to look at something to see if you could see what was going on. So it's a process of close looking, of duration, and again, of paying attention.
Thank you for saying this, Joan, because this is the reason why we choose this image as the cover for the catalog of the Tate Modern Show and the Stedelijk Show. How images are materials that deserve to be permanently observed, and how rich they are in the apparent simplicity. So it's exactly that is the best explanation you could have to justify, or to just tell why we went for this unusual image in the repertoire of Bruce Nauman work. This is one of the few works that are in a collection in Asia, actually in Southeast Asia, one of the very, very crucial works made in 1984. It's in the Tate show. You may be surprised by seeing this bench, and we had a beautiful conversation about should we install the bench or not. The work is big, is, as you can see, is 3 meters by 3.5 meters, and it's 50 centimeters depth. It's a monumental work. It's composed of 4 columns, 4 lines of 25 short sentences, all containing the word live and die in different combination. And what happens is that in different colors, one after the other, they switch on and they generate a very specific composition of sentences that are addressed to the viewer. Why did we decide to install the bench in front of the work? Because we thought this is definitely a sculpture, but it's not a work that has to be seen as a background, a work that requires the viewer to play with it, to interact. This is a work that has a very specific pertinence, had a very specific pertinence, but had also an incredibly dramatic resonance in the moment when the show was installed. And the show was installed in August and will be open from the beginning of October, still into the ravaging pandemic. So everything this work says is also dramatically tuned to contemporary days. And when we had to think, should we put something that allows the viewer to rest and to take a break within this challenging show, decided this is the point where we can put a bench, because this could be seen as a film. When you sit in front of 100 Live and Die, you see a sort of structural movie unfolding in front of your eyes, and you guess what's coming next and what sentence is following and what sentence is in its sequence, revealing or not revealing something about you, your life, the current situation, and the work itself. Of course, in its unfolding, the work also takes full light and makes light reverberating throughout the 4 walls of the space. So in that very specific point, a frontal work that looks like a projection becomes an environment somehow. So it's again, it's a masterpiece. And from how I describe it, I think you realize how we really consider this as a pillars of the exhibition. And as often it's said, is also one of the most complicated works that one can happen to install because of its fragility, but also because of the sequences of the neos and how carefully they have been conceived by the artist in the appearing and disappearing.
Nauman has often gone from something very beautiful to something very cruel. He's in so many works, he's addressed the shift from violence to silence. The way, whether it's metaphoric or directly stated, again, it's another through line in his work. Even mapping the studio, he talks about the mice being predators. And I'm going to read you a quote from Nauman about that. What triggered this piece were the mice. We had a big influx of field mice that summer in the house and in the studio. They were so plentiful, even the cat was getting bored with them. I was sitting around the studio being frustrated because I didn't have any new ideas, and I decided that you just have to work with what you've got. I was interested in the relationship between the cat and the mice, but more in a psychological way. Their relationship exists somewhere between a joke and reality. They've been cartoon characters for so long that we think of them as lighthearted performers, but there is this obvious predator-prey tension between them.
Listen to me. They'll talk to me, I'll listen to them. I'll talk to them.
They'll talk to you. They'll listen.
this is also a beautiful circle, a beautiful loop to the form the Tate Modern exhibition had, which, as I described very briefly at the beginning, has to do with encountering raw material, a sort of self-retrospective that Bruce Nauman conceived when thinking about the proposal he received of presenting within the spectacular and cavernous turbine hall of the Tate a site-specific installation. When the work was acquired, almost 2 years after having been shown in the turbine hall of the Tate Modern, the conservator and the curator got to the point of proposing to the artist the possibility of another display, and with the artist the possibility of the other display. This was where we decided to display the work on the stairwells. I'm tempted to count on one fundamental point that John, you raised in your text, which is walking. And if it's true that Bruce Nauman sees spaces and thinks in spaces, to some extent, the turbine hall can be seen as an enormous corridor, a huge corridor in which the audience is naturally drawn and has to walk. And the artist, by installing 21 sound or 21 double sound speakers, each of them representing only the sound component of a work he made throughout the years, be you may not want to be here, to beat and repeat. Well, all that combined in the end finishes to be a sort of choreography of the audience that intrigued or pulled by the sound next to a wall, moves from one corner to the other of this huge, enormous corridor.
It's one of the most amazing of his pieces. When he visited the space with Nick, he saw a Henry Moore sculpture. And Henry Moore, the idea of Henry Moore has turned up in his work a number of times, whether in a light trap photo or sculpture. It's in the titles of sculptures. But anyway, they saw a Henry Moore. And one of the first thoughts that Bruce had, which he rejected, was to get a crane and pick up a Henry Moore and swing it around the room. But when they were walking the turbine hall, he also heard the sound of the turbines. And that led him to the idea of encapsulating sound within an empty room, that your movement through the space would be following these invisible bands of sound that came from the flat speakers on the long walls and facing each other. So you walk down this ribbon of sound and you entered, again, as you mentioned, in the loop. When you entered, you heard Bruce shouting, "Thank you," as you came in, welcoming you. Made your way all the way down the length of the turbine hall, turned and came back, and you exited through the exact same band, again shouting, "Thank you."
So we can only thank immensely Bruce Nauman for his rich body of work. As he will say, thank you, because thank you, it's something that represents the best, let's say, and simplest sentence to offer to an artist who's been so dramatically productive and incredibly influential and will be relevant for, I think, ever. But this is something that you should say, John, who's been so close and so incredibly keen on championing his work and always finding new entry points and new perspective.
For me, working with him, researching his work for many years, I'm always surprised that when looking at it anew, I see things, I learn things that take me in other directions that I couldn't imagine 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 30 years ago. And that indicates to me that whatever context you're looking at it in, whatever place you're looking at it in, whatever you bring to it, there's a connection. When you were saying thank you, there's an engagement beyond how he makes things, why he makes them. There's a relationship between his work and his audience. And I use the word audience because it's visitor, but also hearing, as well as seeing and moving. It's that crucial engagement.
Well, what you just say, it's like the best way to end a journey in discussing Bruce Naumann's work. Always critical, always dramatically tuned to the reality, although having been conceived 40 years before or 40 minutes before. It's wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
A huge thank you to you both, Joan Simon and Andrea Lissoni, for sharing your extensive knowledge and experience on Bruce's work with us, both in relation to the recent Tate Modern exhibition, which, as Andrea said, is now travelling onto the Stedelijk Museum and opening there at the end of May, and indeed our exhibition at Hong Kong, Presence Absence, which continues through to the 8th of May. Alongside this exhibition, we have a publication which is now available, and it includes an essay by Joan Simon. Finally, we are extremely grateful to Angela Westwater and the whole team at Speroni Westwater for their close collaboration on this White Cube exhibition. Our heartfelt thanks goes to them and again to Bruce Nauman. Many thanks for joining us.